Good evening, friends, and shalom, man. Welcome to this episode of the Watchdog. Take 2 for today's episode because we had some trouble earlier today. I am your host, CJ Cox, here to tell you that we are living in biblical times, and I appreciate everybody for showing up here today. If you guys did catch today's earlier attempt at an episode, I'm sorry. Hopefully we'll be able to have a better episode for you tonight. I'm going to be talking, obviously, a lot of the same kinds of things because this is essentially just me trying again. However, do appreciate you guys being here. Hopefully we're going to not have as many problems here today. I do have a couple things that'll potentially help with any sort of internet issues. But we'll, of course, see what happens. I want to go ahead and stall for time a minute to allow people to come in and, of course, join us. So if you are here, please remember to hit that like button. Please remember to subscribe. Please remember to share and get this out to all the different social media platforms which you frequent. Of course, what good is a message without an audience to hear it? And please consider hitting that bell if you want to get notified every time we go live. Subscribing, of course, if you like the content. And you could even support us on Patreon if you feel that I am worthy of turning this into a career of some kind. Want to go ahead and let you guys know of a couple things that we do have coming up, as well as sort of like developments for the channel. So first things first, I want to let you guys know that Friday's episode is going to be a very awesome one. We're going to actually be interviewing gubernatorial candidate Ammon Bundy, which, by the way, Ammon Bundy for governor of Idaho 2022, excuse me. We're going to be actually interviewing Ammon Bundy here on this channel for about an hour, 10 a.m. Mountain Time, for anybody who is interested. And that is going to be obviously the biggest interview or episode really at all that we've had so far on the channel since we've moved the channel to, or the program rather, to its own channel, being entirely separated from the apologetics work, right? So that's obviously going to be a really cool thing. And you guys definitely won't want to miss that. We're going to have a full hour with him, and hopefully we'll be able to actually keep that one here on YouTube. Obviously, we'll see what ends up happening, right? Ammon Bundy has some less than shall we say, mainstream views, but obviously it would be a little bit problematic for them to be censoring political candidates. So we'll see what ends up happening with that. Nonetheless, I think it'll end up being quite the conversation, and you guys definitely will not want to miss it. The other thing I want to let you guys know, as far as some developments for the channel, is we do have a new logo. Now, some of you guys would already know this because you've seen it, right? It's just sitting there in the lower left-hand corner for you. Some of you guys would already know this because you were here earlier today when we tried to do this episode and, of course, failed because of internet issues. But regardless, we have actually gotten a new logo. Now, I don't have the finished version for you guys, but if you had already seen it, I do have a more completed version than I previously did. And I am going to go ahead and show that to you guys right now. The old, little bit less completed version is still the Synagogue News logo here on YouTube, as well as on Rumble and BitChute, actually. But nonetheless, I want to go ahead and show you guys this logo, as well as the new slogan for the channel, because personally, I do obviously think it's pretty cool. Just so you guys are aware, I don't have new slogans and logos for the show itself, right? The Watchdog logo, the Watchdog motif and title, the, in the face of Armageddon, will you compromise, all that other kind of stuff. That's all show associated itself, but the channel itself does actually now have its own logo, as well as its own little slogan. And I'm going to go ahead and show those to you guys here now. So let me go ahead and get the screen shared. I do see Antonio has joined us here today. Shalom, and thank you for being here, Antonio. I have been told that it's not very professional of me to do these news shows and then acknowledge the live chat. So I might do something where I acknowledge people towards the end, but don't actually acknowledge anybody here at the beginning, because I guess that might be a little bit more professional or something like that. But we'll see what happens regardless. At any rate, so this is the new logo. This is actually a revamping of an old logo that I had some 3 or 4 years ago, but I just decided that I liked it and wanted to bring it back. As you can see, it is the banner that would be sort of like the Captain America shield, right, with my caveman character in the center of it. And the caveman character is obviously heavily based off of Neanderthals. And of course, recently the left has taken to labeling conservatives Neanderthal thinkers, specifically President Joe Biden, when he labeled the people in Texas Neanderthal thinkers for deciding to relax COVID restrictions. And so I decided to just own that particular phraseology, Neanderthal thinker, and go with the slogan, think like a Neanderthal. So we have the Synagogue News, think like a Neanderthal, with, of course, our little Neanderthal character in the center of this American motif, and a traditional kind of character who, of course, is very much not appreciated in our modern culture anymore because of this traditional nature. It is interesting because the Neanderthal motif is something that I had actually adopted long before. I guess I can't say long before. It was about August of 2018. But before any of this Neanderthal thinking business had ever occurred, right? Because of my very traditionalist and fundamentalist beliefs, the two most common insults people would throw at me personally would be, some variation of Neanderthal, Flintstone, cave dweller, caveman, troglodyte, knuckle dragger, whatever, right? Or some variation of stuck in the 50s, 30s, 20s, 40s, etc., right? And so I just decided to combine those two things and create this 1950s caveman character that is the logo for the entire synagogue operation, right? Then, of course, Joe Biden gives us that lovely gem of Neanderthal thinking, and that has now inspired me to create what you guys see in front of you, the logo as well as the Think Like a Neanderthal slogan. So that's going to be the slogan for the channel. If we have advertising for the channel and stuff like that, that's going to be like one of our big advertising things and stuff like that. And this is going to be the official logo, although there's still a more touched up version of this to be happening in the future, right? So I wanted to go ahead and show you guys that because I think it is obviously very cool, and a little bit of us moving forward and being more official here at this channel, right? And we're doing that in a couple different ways, right? Not only do I have my own logo in the form of this character, but also my Watchdog logo has gotten a lot more official looking. My overlays now are obviously incredibly official looking. We're doing banners and things of that nature, right? And so there's a lot of really cool things, I think, developing in this channel by the grace of God, and of course with the help of a lot of friends who are just helping completely for free too, and of their own free accord. People like Nicholas Whitmer and Jamie Russell, who each have their own channels, by the way, if you guys want to check those out. But I just wanted to let you guys know about that. There is still even more stuff to come as well. I want to have transitions as well as an intro and an outro created. I just need to find somebody who's good with all the video editing and that kind of stuff. I already know what it is that I want. I just don't know how to do it. So I need somebody who's capable of doing it. But we're going to get a Watchdog intro here soon. We're going to get little transitions that we're going to have here soon. And we're also going to get an outro set up soon, as well as potentially a Synagogue News commercial. So a lot of cool developments as far as just making this more official, which is obviously going to be nice, right? But wanted to just share those things with you guys in case you were interested. And with that, I want to go ahead and jump into not only our first thing, but also the pre-article discussion for the day, but it will bleed into the articles because we're going to be talking about some articles related to this topic. And that is the thing that I announced recently, which I called Teros Historia. And for those who do not know, I have announced a couple different times. The first time being on my other channel, actually on August the 1st, what I'm going to basically try and form as not only a movement, but also a day for that movement. And I've decided to call this movement, as well as the day that I want to be associated with that movement, Teros Historia, which is Greek meaning guard history, although I'm translating it a little bit less literally, a little bit less formally as preserve history, although the same idea is communicated either way, of course. And the reason why I want to have this particular movement started is because I think we are living in a very dangerous time where it appears that we might actually see the literal erasure of history, not only from the history books, but potentially even like carved out of the mountains in the instances of like things like Mount Rushmore and things of that nature, right? Like we have people who are just completely and totally hell-bent, it seems, on destroying the actual historical narrative of this country and replacing it with seemingly nothing at all, or maybe something that's more akin to their liberal ideology, perhaps, right? But definitely not something that is akin to any accurate history that we could see in, reflected in the historical record. And for those who don't recall, really this whole anti-history thing started with the anti-Bible crew that not only went out of their way to mythicize the Bible and say it was not actually a work of history, but also went out of their way to sort of cancel the Bible in the self-same way that we've seen so many other things and people canceled since then, right? For example, we had popular court cases saying that you couldn't have prayer, scripture reading, or even nativity scenes or 10 Commandments or things of that nature in public places, public schools, government buildings, things like that, right? And of course, all of these rulings came in the 70s, 80s, 90s, in many instances before I was even born, and people of my generation were even born, right? But for the most part, it was at that point in time kind of kept in the academic circles, political circles, judiciary circles, and religious circles, right? But it wasn't something that bled out into the popular culture at large, although in certain instances it did, in the sense that obviously the greater historical community came to the conclusion that they just thought legends in general could not be trusted, although that started to change when they started to discover more about non-white, to be blunt, legends like Native American legends and stuff like that. All of a sudden it became kind of racist to not accept those legends, right? Which, whatever. But eventually it started bleeding into popular culture. This sort of anti-history brigade, this anti-history movement started bleeding into popular culture when it started going after not just the Bible and then other what you might call legendary accounts, which I don't mean to say that the Bible is a legendary account, but I mean to say that, like, for example, things like the Trojan War, Imhotep, stuff like that, right? Not only were the academics going after these things, saying that they didn't really happen and all that other kinds of stuff, but then people started to actually go after the Confederacy, right? And go after them in what at first appeared to be what you might call academic ways, right? For example, they would start to say, well, Robert E. Lee wasn't really the great military commander that everybody said that he was, or states' rights wasn't really a big issue for the Confederacy at the time, right? And a whole bunch of things of that nature, just doing the same thing that they were actually doing in the form of the earlier anti-Bible brigades, right? But now applying it more to the Confederacy, right? And eventually they started going in and bringing this into full fruition. And much like with the Bible, they started canceling it, so to speak, right? Saying you couldn't have the 10 Commandments up, you couldn't have prayer up, you couldn't have Bible, stuff like that. They started doing the same thing with Confederate monuments, Confederate characters, Confederate symbolism, things like the battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia and things of that nature. And that happened to have a what would you call that? I guess crossroad with popular culture, in that that was something that people could attach themselves to and say, see, this is a racist thing. This is something that proves white people are racist. This is something that gives us a form of legitimacy in our complaints against the status quo and against white culture and things of that nature. Excuse me. Ooh. Excuse me again. And it became an incredibly popular thing as a result, because it wasn't something now that was just restricted to these niche circles like, historical circles or religious circles or things like that. But it was something that the greater community and the different media companies and things like that as a whole could get involved in and start to, dip their toes into, so to speak, right? Well, this obviously continues, keeps occurring, gets worse and worse as time goes on, as culture gets more and more woke. But then it has a couple moments where it just explodes in popularity, right? And the first one of these moments was Dylan Roof shooting up the Black church in Charleston, South Carolina in the year 2015. And he did it for racist reasons. That was something that was well established at the time, right? And he was kind of associating himself with neo-Confederate rhetoric and KKK rhetoric and imagery and things like that. And so it caused what many people considered to be a national awakening in a way. And a lot of people started to, in a much more robust and aggressive fashion, question whether or not we should have any sort of remembrance of the Confederacy in the form of these Confederate symbols or Confederate monuments and statues, right? And obviously that gave a large amount of boost to the anti-history movement. So much so that we did actually start to see little creeping elements of the anti-history woke brigades start to show up in our day-to-day lives at that point, right? Like, for example, people started questioning much more so than they already were things like team mascots, like Redskins, Braves, Indians, things of that nature. Nobody was changing anything yet, but it was becoming something that everybody needed to talk about all the time. Also, NASCAR, which famously has Confederate flags flying everywhere because it's a Southern sport, right? Was reevaluating whether or not they were going to allow this symbolism at their races. Not actually doing anything, but once again having the conversation, right? Bringing this more and more into the mainstream. So much so that eventually they decided in Charlottesville, Virginia, that they were going to take down a statue that they had of Robert E. Lee. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that the statue was actually on the University of Virginia campus, but it might not be. I could be wrong about that, but nonetheless, it is in Charlottesville, and they were talking about whether or not they wanted to take this statue down, saying it was a symbol of obviously racism and oppression and all this other kind of stuff. And there was a big rally there. Numerous blatant white supremacists and neo-Nazis did show up to this rally to try and defend the statue. And unfortunately, there were many who believed, as I do, that we need to preserve history and things of that nature, but who weren't white supremacists, who made the decision to actually team up with the white supremacists and march with them. I think that was a really stupid call, personally. I think it's, an example of not having any understanding whatsoever of perceptions. But nonetheless, it happened, and there was a rally, and eventually there was a counter rally with people from Antifa and BLM and things of that nature, and it got violent. People started fighting. Dude gets in his car, who happens to be a white supremacist, decides he's going to plow into a crowd of people. Something like 30 people get injured, and a young woman actually loses her life. And that was the second pop, the second explosion that put an exponential amount of support behind the anti-history brigades and their specifically anti-Confederate agenda, right? And many people at the time, including myself, although I was only on Facebook at the time doing these shows, not YouTube, many people at the time were saying, when this occurred, this anti-history movement will not stop at the Civil War. In fact, if we do give them the Confederate monuments and symbols, we will lose everything else. Guaranteed, mark our words, this is not going to stop here. It's going to move on to every other flawed character, to every other potential slave owner, racist, guy who potentially had problems with his wife, guy who wasn't lining up with our modern perceptions of homosexuality or whatever it happens to be, right? These people, these brigades, they're going to come for everybody. And at the time, it was simply an argument and a prediction, right? But obviously the Charlottesville thing amplified everything. And now a whole bunch of people were wanting to take down these statues, and you started to see not just the slight rearing of the ugly head in popular culture, but actually full-blown infiltration into the culture after this moment. I can give you a couple of very popular examples. One famous example is here on YouTube. History content creators like Simon Whistler and Cody Franklin from Alternate History Hub and Emperor Tiger Star and Extra Credits and a whole bunch of other people who made history videos started to find their content being demonetized and shadow banned if they decided to talk about either the American Civil War or World War II. Why? Well, because people were offended by reference to the American Civil War, specifically the Confederacy, and offended by reference to World War II, specifically the Nazi Party. In fact, one of my favorite strikebacks at this particular example was when Cody Franklin of Alternate History Hub actually would replace the swastika whenever he would do a video about World War II or about Nazi Germany. He would replace the swastika with a YouTube symbol. And that would kind of be a double whammy in a sense, because in one way he was saying, or he was allowing his video to remain monetized by removing Nazi imagery from the video. But on another end, he was kind of making the point that, you know, YouTube's kind of acting like the fascists here, policing historical content, whether or not we're allowed to talk about alternate history, biography, military history, things of that nature. Actually policing our words simply because we're mentioning things like the Nazi Party or the Confederacy. Another really popular example is Call of Duty World War II, right? Where you saw the Germans in this game being completely stripped of any and all Nazi ideology, propaganda, or imagery. And so you would have these flags. They'd be red flags with the white circle. And then what would you actually have inside the white circle? Not a swastika, but a German Iron Cross. Why? Well, because once again, people were offended at Nazi imagery in the video game, even though you're fighting these people in the video game, right? You're against them. And in fact, I've often quipped with the question, if these people aren't Nazis, why are you killing them in this video game? Obviously, it's a video game, right? But nonetheless, I think the point is still made, and fairly strongly. If these people aren't Nazis, what's the point of us all getting together and shooting them throughout this video game, right? Obviously, that seems to be sending a pretty weird and conflicting message, in my opinion, but whatever. The point being that here we saw now examples of popular culture actually being impacted in such a way that you were not able to, in both of these instances, tell a story, in one instance fictional and in one instance non-fictional. We're not actually able to tell a story, right, without having the anti-history brigades and the woke police actually clean any unsavory images or ideologies out of the story first, even if it was a story that happened in real life, right? And it didn't even just stop there, of course. There was obviously the whole thing with the Redskins, right? That eventually boiled over after a certain point in time, namely 2020. And we'll get to some of the things that happened after 2020, but nonetheless, you see this progressive movement towards literally cleaning history out, right? Literally removing history from, in this particular instance, our academic fields, because YouTube is popularizing through these people like Simon Whistler and Cody Franklin, academics, and in our fictional fields, things like video games. And by the way, I could mention more than just Call of Duty World War II, right? Obviously, there was huge criticism for Dunkirk for having the audacity to have an all-white cast, even though all of the soldiers who fought at Dunkirk were white. Sorry, it's just a matter of history, right? but the anti-history brigades had to wokeify everything, right? And then you had your third pop, probably your worst out of all of them, and that was the death of George Floyd. And with the death of George Floyd, you saw a reckoning, the likes of which I don't think this nation was really expecting. I don't think it really could have been expecting, even, you know, if you were being the most optimistic as a progressive or most cynical as a conservative. And seemingly overnight, virtually everywhere that any Confederate imagery at all popped up was wiped. You couldn't find anything on Amazon or anything like that any longer. That was gone, right? NASCAR pulled the trigger on banning imagery from their races. The Redskins changed their name. The Indians changed their name. The Braves started banning the sale of the tomahawk and removed their tomahawk logo. People started questioning the Blackhawks. The Edmonton Eskimos changed their name. We removed the logo from Land O'Lakes and removed the logo from Uncle Ben's and removed the logo from, well, not the logo, but the shape of the bottle from Mrs. Buttersworth, even though it's not even a black woman, and removed the logo from Aunt Jemima and so on and so forth, right? And saw this huge cleansing of any and all references to ethnic groups really at all, right? Whether they be Black, Asian, Native American, what have you, as well as this continued purge of just straight up American history. And as predicted, it didn't just stick to culture. It didn't just stick to the Confederacy, but people started going after monuments to the 54th Massachusetts as well, monuments to to Clark and Sacagawea as well, monuments to Abraham Lincoln as well, started going after things like Plainsmen and Frontiersmen and Davy Crockett and the Texas Revolution in 1776 and all this other kinds of stuff, right? And the point kind of just being that here we now exist in the year 2021, and two things have become established and very clear. Number one, that it was not actually just an argument, but was indeed the facts. The Confederate flag was the stone wall and is the stone wall. Pun absolutely intended. What do I mean by that? I mean, if you give up to the progressives on the matter of the Confederate flag, they come for everything. They come for your sports logos. They come for your brands. They come for history in your video games. They come for history regarding your founding. They come for everything, right? That flag there is basically operating, as I said, as the stone wall that keeps the anti-history brigades out of essentially our textbooks, right? Out of our historical narrative. And again, that's no longer an argument. That's now in 2021. That's just a fact of history, right? Or maybe we could call it reality, if you'd like, right? Instead of calling it a fact of history, because we're still living in the moment, right? It's no longer, hey, if you guys give this up, this is going to happen. It is now, y'all started to give this up, and look what happened, right? So that's the first thing that you should notice here. The second thing that you should notice here, right, is that we are living in an age that, once again, it is no longer an argument, is about to be cleansed of the knowledge of its history. Quite literally, right? It will be gone. It obviously can't be completely gone in our own lifetime because we know it, right? We know our own history, and therefore it does have to at least last until our generation's demise, right? But we are dangerously close to a time in history where we do not actually have awareness of what happened in our past. And in fact, I think for a lot of the younger generations, especially people in my generation and younger, we are already there. Mark Dice and many others have gone around asking people, you know, and it's, you know, it's funny when you ask them, like, can you define nationalism, or, you know, why do you actually hate the MAGA hat and stuff like that? But it reveals how dumb they are and all that other kind of stuff. But when you start asking them even questions like, hey, who was the president during the Civil War? And people can't answer it. What's the First Amendment say? And people don't know what you're talking about. Who was the president when 9/11 happened? That should be simple enough. It was only 20 years ago. And people don't know what you're talking about. And by the way, in case you don't believe those videos, I do have at least my own personal antidote, and I'm sure you could go asking around yourself. Go ask a 22-year-old who was president during the time of the Civil War. Ask him who the president was in the 1990s, or the president in 9/11, or what the revolution was about, right? Or so on and so forth. Who's Napoleon, right? Just ask him any of these questions. I guarantee you don't get solid answers. And what we have is, in combination with the destruction of our history because of these rabid anti-history people, right? We also have an incredibly ignorant population that simply does not have any awareness whatsoever of what actually occurred to them and occurred to their nation in the past, right? And so because of those things, because of the fact that we live in such a dangerous time in regards to losing history forever, and I mean that literally, because it's happened to other groups in the past, okay? Like, if you guys think that this is a crazy thing, the Romans had plumbing, and somehow plumbing, as well as a whole bunch of other things, was lost for all of Europe for 1,000+ years. What's the point? The point is just to say that these things do disappear, and they don't come back for generation after generation after generation after generation after generation ad infinitum, until the Lord decides that they get to come back, right? And we're very close to that. So because of that, I have decided, number one, I want to start a movement around the preservation of history, which I am calling Teros Historia. Number two, that I want to, I have decided that I want to have a Memorial Day, right? Like, 4th of July, that kind of thing, right? That I'm also going to call Teros Historia for this day, which I've put as April 10th. Number three, I have chosen April 10th as well as the symbol for this particular movement, namely the Confederate flag, for a very specific reason. And that reason is that this is the hill where the battle is taking place. Okay. The battle, if we're fighting about the founders, if we're fighting about whether or not we're allowed to talk about Nazis in video games and YouTube videos, if we're fighting about whether or not we are being racist by paying homage to Native Americans or some other form of an ethnic group, right? If we're talking about that, we've already lost. Right? So the stone wall here, pun again absolutely intended, is the Confederate monuments, Confederate symbolism. And so I am choosing the day of Lee's farewell address, which is April 10th, as the day centering this movement. I am choosing the battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia as the symbol for this movement. And I am asking all of you to please join me in this movement. Just to be clear, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, neo-Confederates, things of that nature are not welcome, because that is not what we are about. This is about preservation of history. It is not about the South rising again. It is a good thing the South lost the Civil War. But I think that this is an incredibly important thing, and something that absolutely needs to be fought for stronger than it is. People talk about like, oh, people get hit over the head with MAGA hats, and, people are banning the Betsy Ross flag, and Chick-fil-A is getting banned, and all this other sort of stuff. And I know it all seems like it's unrelated, but it did stem from this ground zero, this hill, this stone wall, and that is the Confederate flag, right? That's the one that they're like, see, we can get you. All we got to do is convince you that if something is offensive that we can clean it out of history and clean it out of popular culture. And if you agree to that even one time, which they got you to agree to it, and by you, I mean American society, to agree to it in the form of Confederate flags and monuments, right? If we can get you to agree to that even one time, then we can use it again and again and again and again and again. It's the exact same thing that happened with the LGBT movement as far as the complete destruction of marriage. It's the exact same thing that happened with the sexual liberation movement in regards to the complete sexualization of girls. It's a common technique of, hey, if we can just get you to accept the logic, we can reuse the logic again to take down everything that you put in our way that does not allow us to act in the way in which we want to act. And so because of that, get the hashtag going, Teros Historia. We're going to have some sort of a event on April the 10th next year, Lord willing. And it will be the first ever Teros Historia event. Hopefully it'll be in person. Hopefully we'll have people able to go there. And hopefully we'll be able to get this popular enough that we have some level of influence, right? Because, you know, it is an important thing. I think that it's no coincidence, in my opinion, that we see the elimination of the historical record at the same time that we see a complete obliteration of thought and reasoning and morality and so many other things in our culture today. And by the way, just to give you guys some brief idea as to where this is, sorry, just some examples of this happening in our life, right? So here you have Mississippi changing its flag isn't the end of Confederate symbols and state flags. This is an article from CNN last year, sorry. I think it was July 1st, 2020, talking about how, hey, look, I know Mississippi changed its flag, and I know we got a big win here removing Confederate symbolism, but it isn't good enough. It isn't good enough. We need to see the removal of it from everything else, right? And so, by the way, this is just showing you some different Confederate flags. I'm not reading the article here, but the Alabama flag, see, it looks too much like the Confederate flag, so it needs to go. We can't have it anymore. Something that we're not able to have. Arkansas flag, well, you see that fourth star right there, that one tiny little detail, it's technically a reference to the Confederate flag. So it's got to leave. We're not allowed to have it. The Florida flag, well, obviously it looks exactly like the Alabama flag, and it even has the audacity to mention God. So of course we got to get rid of that one. Georgia flag, well, obviously that's a direct reference to the Stars and Bars. So got to get rid of that one. In other words, they win with the Mississippi flag. And so what do? Call for the complete and total abolishment of everything else. In other words, it's not good enough. It's not good enough, right? Stupid ads. Here we move on to a different article. Judge Dorsey's unprecedented order on a Confederate statue. This is from July 25th of this year, so this is even new. It turns out that they're not actually going to let me read this because I don't pay for the content. Well, that's no fun. Basically, the ruling was that the monuments could be taken down if they cause significant distress to members of the community. Which think of the logic behind that. Think of where that ends up leading. Think of where that goes. I've already given you some examples of where that goes in the form of cleaning out your ability to actually tell even the straightforward historical narrative or a story around the historical narrative, such as in video games, right? And I'm not even saying that we should be people playing a bunch of video games and stuff like that. I think Call of Duty is kind of, a little atrocious sometimes, to be honest with you. Not all video games are, but sometimes Call of Duty can get bad. But the point just being, if somebody is making a video game about World War II, well, the enemy in World War II was Nazis. They should be able to include that because that's accurate, right? Here we see rebel flags removed from fair display. We had a fair down in, I believe it was Mississippi. No, excuse me. Madison County. I think that's Tennessee, actually. Madison County, I'm pretty sure, is in Tennessee. Anyways, where they had a this flag that you see right here. It's obviously the Confederate flag with the Ole Miss Rebel, which used to be the logo for Ole Miss University. The vendor had to leave, take this down, issue an apology. The fair itself issued an apology. It's just a man selling the product, right? However, not something that they're allowed to do, apparently. There are people that are offended by this, and to be honest, he was very cooperative. Donahue said, I'm sorry if I caused the Kiwanis any controversy or something like that. So the man, obviously, he just takes it, saying, all right, fine, I'll deal with it, which he shouldn't have done. But once again, what's the internal logic we have here? Oh, some people are getting offended by it, so I'm not allowed to sell this product of mine here, right? So we're going to start policing what I can and can't sell, policing what I can and can't say, policing what I can and can't display, policing the history that I can give, basing things off of whether or not people are offended by it. Here we had people saying, let's stop tolerating the Confederate flag, right? So let's get to a point where we're actually intolerant of people who have the audacity to think of this as their own heritage or something along those lines, which I'm personally not Southern. I don't understand using the flag as your heritage, but I know people who are Southern. I know Black people who are Southern who think of this as a symbol of their heritage. They're not allowed to do that, though, apparently, because whoever it is that's writing this article in the Daily News doesn't want us to tolerate that sort of thing. And so on and so forth. I actually just almost revealed a little bit of what we were going to talk about next. But the point is, this is an important movement for us to stand up for. It's no longer an argument. It won't stop here. It is now, hey, guys, they didn't stop here. So why don't you move back up to the battlefield and let's go ahead and fight this out, right? And at this point, we're taking the Stonewall back, okay? Because we did already lose it. We gave this up. So, and I've often said here on this show, the idea that we're fighting a culture war is preposterous. The culture war is lost. At best, we get a cultural revolution. And if we are going to do anything along those lines, by the way, we need to make sure that it is Christ-centered. Now, you may wonder, how do I tie Christ-centeredness into the preservation of history? And I would actually say in this way, history is God's story, in a literal sense, like in an actual sense. What do I mean by that? I mean, so like Star Wars is George Lucas's story. He wrote it. The characters are his, the events are his, the happenings are his, the good guys and the bad guys and what takes place and the moral of the story and all of that are all his, right? Well, guess what? There's a real story and a real author. The real author is God, and the real story is reality. And you do not have the right to censor God's story. You don't have the right to burn books, period, but you definitely don't have the right to burn God's book. And obviously, I'm not saying that history is on the same level as like the Bible, for example. So please don't misunderstand my analogy. But I am saying that in a very real sense, history is God's book, God's movie, God's play, if you will. And you do not have a right to censor God. Okay. So if you want to ask, how can you tie the preservation of history in with making sure that cultural revolution is done from a Christian perspective? That is how. We do not have the right to censor God's story, even if it's something that makes us uncomfortable. In fact, if anything, we should use the fact that it makes us uncomfortable to make us a stronger nation, a stronger people, and stronger individuals. And I've been talking about that 45 minutes now. So while we still have a little bit of time, we're going to go ahead and move on to something else. But I got to set up my banner real quick. So give me just one moment, friends. Thank the Lord that internet has been doing well so far. I think you guys are going to like at least some of the stories that we have today, although not all of them. In fact, the next one's going to be probably pretty stressful, I'll be honest with you. Just one moment. By the way, when I was talking about how we're going to have like more transitions and stuff like that, one thing that I'm thinking of getting started on here, I'll let you guys know about this while I'm typing the stuff in and setting it up. One thing that I'm thinking of getting started here is potentially making commercials, not just for the Synagogue and the Synagogue News, but also for other brothers' channels and as well as other companies that might be smaller or might be coming at things from a conservative perspective or might in some other way be related to us and or controversial. And that would allow us, I think, to create somewhat of a community where people were paying their people who they trusted to get advertising space because they'd be advertising on their own programs, but also would kind of allow us to let you guys know about, hey, you know, there's this debate channel over here. Go ahead and check it out. Hey, there's this company in this area. Go ahead and check it out. You know, all that other kind of stuff. And so I'm wondering about some stuff like that, maybe setting up like little commercials, like I said, if you will, and allowing for breaks and opportunities like that as a result. But I'm not really 100% sure about that. That might make it a little bit, you know, obviously this is more podcast style. But even podcasts like Daily Wire and such do have small breaks at least. So just a small idea I'm tossing out there. Maybe you guys can let me know what you think about it. At any rate, I'm almost done with this here. Just a moment. We are going to go a little bit over our hour, unfortunately, today. I do apologize for that, friends, but it will be worth it. I promise you. If you're in the live chat right now, if you're here with us, please remember to like and share. Subscribe if you have not done so. Get this out to all the different social media platforms you frequent. And hit that bell if you want to get notified every time we go live. We're not done yet, but I just wanted to drop that on you guys here real quick. All right. So the AMA, or the American Medical Association, has officially and blatantly and indisputably and inarguably and obviously discredited itself henceforth and forevermore. And I hope you guys don't mind that I'm getting a little animated at this point. But the next story that we're about to discuss is agitating. And that's an understatement. That is me being somewhat nice, if you will. The AMA has officially discredited itself. Now, of course, we already knew that the different academic institutions were in the process of discrediting themselves by virtue of woke ideology, that this was bleeding into history. That's part of the Teros Historia thing, that this was bleeding into religious studies, economics, different scientific fields, so on and so forth. Well, now it is officially bled into the American Medical Association. This is from WebMD. And WebMD was publishing this in June, so it is roughly 2 months old at this point. I hope that doesn't offend anybody. Sometimes I do miss things, especially since there was a pretty long hiatus in the middle of this year, right? But according to the AMA, we should remove sex from public birth certificates. No, I didn't make that up. Remove sex from public birth certificates, AMA says. This is an article from WebMD by Marcia Frelick. And by the way, as is tradition, the article we're reading is against us. Why are we reading an article against us? Because I want to prove the point that we don't have to use right-wing sources, conservative sources, conspiratorial sources in order to get to the conclusions that you guys are completely out of your mind and that you are actually literally coming for not only us, but our children. I don't have my own children, but you guys get the idea. Remove sex from public birth certificates. AMA says. Let's go ahead and read, shall we? Sex should be removed as a legal designation on the public part of birth certificates, the American Medical Association said Monday. Requiring it can lead to discrimination and unnecessary burden on individuals whose current gender identity does not align with their designation at birth, namely when they register for school or sports, adopt, get married, or request personal records. A person's sex designation at birth would still be submitted to the U.S. Standard Certificate of Live Birth, for medical, public health, and statistical use only, report authors note. Willie Underwood III, a medical doctor and author of Board Report 15, explained that a standard certificate of live birth is critical for uniformly collecting and processing data, but the government issues birth certificates to individuals. 10 states allow gender-neutral designation. According to the reports, 48 states, Tennessee and Ohio, are the exceptions, and the District of Columbia allow people to amend their sex designation on their birth certificate to reflect their gender identities. But only 10 states allow for a gender-neutral designation, usually X, on birth certificates. I'm going to go ahead and read that again in case you thought that we actually weren't as far along in the path to destruction as we actually are. But let me go ahead and bring you to reality by repeating this again. According to the report, 48 out of the 50 states in the country, Tennessee and Ohio are the exceptions, as well as the District of Columbia, allow people to amend their sex designation on their birth certificate to reflect their gender identities. In other words, they allow people to blatantly lie and tell mistruths for the sake of appeasing their egos. They are literally in the process of using wrong speak for the sake of appealing to people's feelings. 48 states, including probably the one you live in, because let's be honest, the majority of the population of the world ain't in Tennessee or Ohio, or of America, I should say. Yeah, 48 of them, plus the District of Columbia. I bet you didn't know that. And 10 of those states allow for a gender-neutral designation, namely X, on those birth certificates. In other words, while those 48 states allow you to change from one to the other, these 10 states actually go as far as to say, no, you can be completely neutral of gender entirely, at least on our official records. Bet you didn't know that either. Maybe some of you did, and if you did, I commend you. The State Department does not currently offer an option for a gender-neutral designation on U.S. passports. Quote, assigning sex using binary variables in the public portion of the birth certificate fails to recognize the medical spectrum of gender identity, end quote, Underwood said, and can be used to discriminate. Yes, this is what the American Medical Association is now saying. They have fully drinking the woke Kool-Aid. They have gone down the rabbit hole. They are in bed with the Marxists, if you will. So when people say, hey, well, the American Medical Association says in the recent DSM, okay, you can now officially rest assured that that doesn't matter because the AMA has discredited itself entirely. Jeremy Toller, a medical doctor and delegate from GLMA, Health Professionals Advancing LGBTQ Equality, said transgender, gender non-binary, and individuals with differences in sex development can be placed at a disadvantage by the sex label on the birth certificate. Yes, they can be placed at a disadvantage, apparently. We're actually harming these people by accurately describing them on their birth certificates. How? I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. But apparently we are. Apparently we need to do something about it. Namely, remove gender distinction from people's birth certificates. I don't know. It's what the experts say. Do you not trust the experts? I mean, what, are you going to get open heart surgery from your neighbor? Not to preempt the ridiculous rebuttals to what we might be thinking here today. But, you know. Quote, we unfortunately still live in a world where it is unsafe in many cases for one's gender to vary from the sex assigned at birth, end quote, Toller said. I think that is incredibly overblown. I absolutely don't deny that there have been persecutions that trans people have had to face, because anybody who is considered to be odd by the greater demographic is obviously going to experience some level of hatred and persecution. That's just sort of, unfortunately, the nature of humanity. So I don't deny that that occurred. But I think that's absolutely overblown, and especially in the year 2021. In fact, I think it's quite the opposite in our day. I think if you actually were to do something that is actually not only discriminatory, but actually aggressive and violent towards trans people, I think you would be chastised very strongly, and by virtually everybody. And not that you shouldn't, by the way. Obviously, just because I disagree with the LGBT agenda does not mean that I agree with violence against them or anything like that, right? But the point just being that I think you're far more likely to receive condemnation for being anti-trans than you are to actually experience somebody committing some level of anti-trans violence. I think that's absolutely the case. Not having this data on the widely used form will reduce unnecessary reliance on sex as a stand-in for gender, he said, and would, quote, serve as an equalizer, end quote, since policies differ by state. Robert Jackson, a medical doctor and alternate delegate from the American Academy of Cosmetic Surgery, spoke against the measure. Thank God. Quote, we are physicians and need to report things accurately, end quote. One more time. I actually did misread that a little bit. We as physicians need to report things accurately, end quote, says Jackson. Imagine that a scientist thinks that somebody should report the science accurately, that a medical doctor actually thinks that he should take his job seriously. Mind absolutely and utterly blown. I can't believe that such a thing exists in the real world. This man must be bigoted. That's the only explanation. And you're probably bigoted too because you disagree. And heck, I must be bigoted because I'm saying this so sarcastically. I mean, it's the only thing that makes sense, right? Absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense. Quote, all through medical school, residency, and specialty training, we were supposed to delegate all of the physical findings of the patient we're taking care of. I think when the child is born, they do have physical characteristics, either male or female, and I think that probably should be on the public record. That's just my personal opinion, end quote. Well, nobody cares about your personal opinion, Mr. Robert Jackson, medical doctor from the American Academy of Cosmetic Surgery. Nobody cares, okay? Because science and things like that obviously take a back seat to feelings, haven't you heard? Clearly, you're not woke enough. Sarah Mae Smith, medical doctor and delegate from California, speaking on behalf of the Women's Physician section, said removing the sex designation is important to moving toward gender equality. Or equity, whatever. Same thing. Quote, we need to recognize gender as not a binary, but a spectrum, end quote, she said. Now, of course, you can't recognize something that isn't true. You can only recognize things that are, in fact, the case. And since gender is indeed a binary, you can't recognize that gender is not a binary because that would involve gender not being a binary, and gender is, in fact, a binary. Are you seeing my problem? Quote, obligating our patients to jump through numerous administrative hoops to identify as who they are based on a sex assigned at birth, primarily on genitalia, is not only unnecessary, but actively deleterious to their health. Translation, facts are offensive to people who don't actually line up their lives with the facts, and I think that might be harmful. They bring up the example here. She noted that the report mentions that race of a person's parents used to be included on the public portion of the birth certificate, and that information was recognized to sometimes lead to discrimination. And of course, a couple things there. Number one, that's absolutely ridiculous. Obviously, like for example, if a guy is going to get a job, right? and he's black, and personally, I don't know if you have a hard time deducing whether or not a person is black, but I tend to look at them and I figure it out pretty quickly. And I'm sure they feel the same way about people who are white. It's not like it's obvious or anything, right? But I'm sure that it's not obvious to these people, and that these people actually, I don't know what. Looked at their birth certificate. Turns out they're black people. I guess I won't hire them. Guarantee you that's the way it works out in reality, right? Of course, that's not the way it works out in reality, of course, right? I said of course twice. I'm Jay from the Department of Redundancy Department. Anyways, but also on top of that, discrimination on the basis of race is rightfully so illegal. So it's not like this was doing anything, and by the way, not just discrimination in hiring. I know my particular example there was hiring, but discrimination in giving somebody a loan, in giving somebody a house, or renting to somebody a house rather, or in education or whatever. It's literally illegal. You can't do it. It's against the law. Like, I don't know how much against systemic racism we could possibly get, how much more against systemic racism we could possibly get than literally not legal. And by the way, it can be medically relevant for somebody's race or ethnic group to be noted. There are certain diseases, there are certain genetic traits that you are more likely to have if you are from certain ethnic groups or from certain races. That's just a fact of medicine, right? And it's not like there's any one race that's any better at it, right? We all have certain flaws, right? Genetically speaking. But nobody's going to know what exactly those flaws are unless they're able to actually see, oh, hey, as it turns out, this person has African descent, so they may, and just to give an example, unfortunately, I don't know for a lot of the different races, but I can give you at least an example for white people and an example for black people. So to give an example for black people, sickle cell anemia, right? Obviously, it's quite well known that, and I don't know if it's that white people don't get sickle cell anemia or if they're just very, very, very unlikely to get sickle cell anemia. But regardless, if you happen to be from African descent, you are actually capable of getting this disease we know as sickle cell anemia, whereas other races don't seem to be able to do that. Another example in regards to Caucasian people. Caucasian people have exponentially larger genetic predisposition to skin cancer. And gee, I wonder why. We're severely demelanated, right? Makes sense. Now, obviously, I can't go on an exhaustive list of all the different races and ethnic groups, but the point is that's important for a doctor to know. And it's important for some other things too, and not the race aspect, but the gender aspect. It's important for other things too, because when you're talking about sports and things of that nature, right? Yeah, now I'm sorry, men don't belong in women's sports, period. End of the conversation. We have a physical advantage in virtually every sporting category out there. It's not offensive. It's not anti-woman. It's just the truth. Okay, small, short, skinny men tend to have greater muscle mass than muscular, athletic women. It's just a fact. I'm sorry, but it is. In fact, I'll give you a perfect example. Think of popular female fighters. Ronda Rousey, Holly Holmes, the woman known as Cyborg, Gina Carino, who, of course, was popularly fired from The Mandalorian, right? These are buff women. Obviously, they're fighters. They're athletes, right? Now, compare those women to, forget the heavyweights, like, somebody like a Kimbo Slice or a Brock Lesnar or absolute behemoths like that. What about, like, Chuck Liddell, Lyoto Machida? Even smaller than that, maybe. BJ Penn, Tito Ortiz. Smaller than that, maybe. Conor McGregor. Manny Pacquiao to go into boxing. Floyd Mayweather, right? These girls are tiny compared to these dudes. And these girls are at the, tip-top shape. These are fighters. These are warriors. But beat the all-loving crap out of you and I. Right? But you compare them to athletes in the male side, right? Like their equivalents, their male equivalents. Not even close. Not even close. Male heavyweights at their lowest are 205 pounds. There isn't a single female fighter who's 205 pounds. That is the low end of heavyweight fighters, right? And that's just one example. The point being that, now when we start talking about sports and gender, right? I just gave some examples of how race could be important for a medical doctor to know. But now we're talking about things like sports and things like gender. Yeah, that's important for purposes of fairness, for purposes of just ethics in general, right? Like, I don't think it's right for a 200-pound man to beat up on a 140-pound woman, or even for a 140-pound man to beat up on a 140-pound woman, because quite frankly, a couple well-known facts about men have greater bone density, men have 15% greater muscle mass than women, men have greater what you would call quick twitch reflexes in the martial arts world, but what I don't necessarily know what the medical term would be, but basically the ability to kind of move your body in ways that it's hard for me to describe because I'm not a kinesiologist or anything like that. But basically, to give an example, like when you punch somebody, you can bring your fist back to your chin in guard mode very quickly. You're more likely to be able to do that as a man than as a woman. Greater dexterity as a man than as a woman. Hand-eye coordination when it comes to fighting in particular, because obviously that can vary depending on what task you're doing. The point being, it's important. The point being, it's not fair for people to just get in a ring or get on a football field or get in a basketball court with women if they're men. It's not fair. It's relevant to put that kind of stuff on a birth certificate. And the AMA has officially completely and totally discredited itself, buying into woke ideology, drinking the woke Kool-Aid and saying, no, we think that it should be removed from the birth certificate entirely. It's not important. In fact, we think it leads to discrimination and is comparable to people using race to not hire folks. Just in case you were confused as to where we were in our march towards absolute destruction. We're going for an hour and 7 minutes, it appears. So let's see. Well, yeah, you know what? Might as well. I got one last thing to talk about. We're not going to end right now. I got one last thing to talk about. My header for this portion, will we see the repeal of Roe v. Wade? One more time, will we see the repeal of Roe v. Wade? Now, why am I asking this question? Because many in the pro-life world are asking this question at the moment because of a couple of cases that the Supreme Court has agreed to hear that if they are ruled in a certain way, will actually repeal Roe v. Wade. I know that sounds unbelievable, but actually that is the case. There are two different cases, one from Kentucky and one from Mississippi, that the Supreme Court has agreed to hear that if they are ruled in a certain way, in other words, if the courts come down on one of the two sides, namely the sides of each of the respective states, Kentucky and Mississippi, if the courts come down on their side, we will see the repeal of Roe v. Wade. By the grace of God, somehow, some way through the chaos, we're actually that close. Now, I am not optimistic, despite this closeness, about our ability to do so. I think, if I can just be blunt with it, that we don't have the votes on the Supreme Court bench to actually repeal Roe v. Wade. I think Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas would absolutely vote to repeal Roe v. Wade. And I suspect that Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett would also vote to repeal Roe v. Wade. Though I'm not 100% convinced either of them would, because both of them explicitly said they wouldn't. But they could have been playing politics. But I do not believe Neil Gorsuch would vote to repeal Roe v. Wade. And I'm 100% convinced that the other four would not vote to repeal Roe v. Wade. It's not even a question in regards to the other four. The idea that like Roberts or Sotomayor is going to vote to repeal Roe v. Wade, I mean, it's comical, right? It makes me chuckle. There's no way it's going to happen. I don't know if I believe that Gorsuch will actually come down on the side of repealing, and I think he's going to end up being the swing vote. That's my personal prediction. I think it'll be 4-5, and I think that Gorsuch will be the swing vote that actually disappoints everybody and finds himself on the side of the pro-aborts. And I wouldn't be surprised if it was not 4-5, but actually 3-6. Because I wouldn't be surprised if either Kavanaugh or Barrett actually wasn't playing politics and indeed was being honest when they told Congress they would not repeal Roe v. Wade. Now, it is possible that we could see a 5-4 ruling in favor of the states, in other words, in favor of repealing Roe v. Wade. And that would more than likely be a vote of Alito, Thomas, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett against the other four. And that would obviously be major. That would be absolutely massive. And I think it would kind of sneak up on people too, because we are so far gone that to think we could actually have this big of a win in the midst of this chaos might seem, I don't know, it might seem like it's coming out of left field. And in ways it is. Now, there's a lot of things I want to say, right? The more important of the cases is this one here. This is the Wikipedia article for it. Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. And I'm going to go ahead and read the Wikipedia portion here for you, but I advise you, please read about this more for yourself. And when you do read about it, obviously use greater sources than the one I'm using now. I'm using Wikipedia, not because I don't think Wikipedia is a bad source. I'm just saying it's a general source, right? To give you the brief idea. But if you want to get in depth with this, obviously you're going to want to get probably local news sources or official government documents. And once we have those, we're going to show those to you. But unfortunately, I figured out about this mere hours before this show. So I was not able to collect everything that I wanted to. But actually, in fact, it was kind of an interesting thing. What had occurred is basically other people were talking about hey, are we going to see the repeal of Roe v. Wade? And, at first I was like, no, this is just some like rhetoric or something, right? Because the first person that it ends up being talked about on is Dr. Michael Brown is apparently doing a show on it, right? And I'm like, no, there's no way that's he's just, whatever. It's his radio show. I don't really care, right? But then other people start talking about it too, right? People who are here on the Twitter sphere, more associated with the pro-life movement, groups, like Live Action, for example, and Life Site News and stuff like that. They start talking. So now I'm starting to get kind of curious, right? And so I go and I chime into Dr. Brown's show for a little bit. I asked the question, all right, what's the name of the court case? And nobody had apparently given it in the radio show, but somebody in the live chat, actually Slam RN, if you guys know who she is, was able to provide me with the information. It's, Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health Organization. So I'm like, all right, cool. I got the information I need. Start looking into this. And lo and behold, find newspapers from Jackson, Mississippi, and from Kentucky in a completely different case that isn't even being referenced by people. That, the Supreme Court's totally about to hear cases that could overturn Roe v. Wade. And obviously I'm hopeful. I don't want to get optimistic because I know where we're at, but I am hopeful, and I will be praying, of course, for the repeal of Roe v. Wade in these cases. But nonetheless, let's do a little reading here. Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization is a pending U.S. Supreme Court case dealing with the constitutionality of a 2018 Mississippi state law that banned abortion operations after the first 15 weeks of pregnancy. Lower courts had ruled in preliminary injunctions to prevent enforcement of the law on the basis that the law violated the holding of women's rights in Roe v. Wade, which generally allows for women to opt out of abortions within the first 20, or opt for abortions, within the first 24 weeks. So you see here, while even though the Mississippi law certainly does not go far enough, it does bare minimum require the court to make a decision as to whether or not they will repeal Roe v. Wade because of that 9-week discrepancy between the 15 weeks allowed in the Mississippi law and the 24 weeks allowed in the original Roe v. Wade ruling. What that effectively means is if the courts rule in favor of the constitutionality of a 15-week ban, Roe v. Wade has to either be outright abolished or amended, and that opens the door for more what the left would term radical, but what we might term rational, which of course happen to rhyme. So I think that's ironic, but nonetheless, more rational laws in regards to this, such as heartbeat bills, right? Or laws that recognize life at the point of conception, which people have tried to pass, but unfortunately can't get past the lower courts because of Roe v. Wade. And a lot of people have actually suggested that this law was passed in a strategic way. In other words, that Mississippi conservatives do wish to see something more akin to a heartbeat bill, but that they wanted to just get a foot in the door so that they could see Roe v. Wade repealed. And if that's the case, then, we'll see if it works, I guess. If it works, then I guess I don't have anything negative to say. If it doesn't work, then I figure, you might as well go big or go home. But perhaps that's even naive of me to think. But nonetheless, you can see that this law is designed in such a way that the court is forced to make a decision. Will we uphold the constitutionality of the Mississippi state law, or will we uphold the constitutionality of court precedent, namely Roe v. Wade? And if they decide in favor of Mississippi law, that means Roe v. Wade is bare minimum heavily amended and more than likely completely overturned. And that would be a watershed moment for certain in American history. Now, is that going to happen? Again, I kind of doubt it. I kind of doubt it. I don't have faith in either of the three conservative justices, quote unquote, that Trump appointed. I've been pleasantly surprised by Kavanaugh so far, I will admit, and I have been unfortunately disappointed by Gorsuch, who I thought was the best of the three. So it's not like my word is by any means law, no pun intended, actually pun totally intended, why not, when it comes to these judges, right? But I just can't say that I've seen enough to properly trust them, and especially Gorsuch, because Gorsuch has already been very disappointing, specifically in regards to religious freedom, which again was shocking to me, right? I thought he would not be disappointing. I thought he would be the most conservative of the three. So I'm skeptical. But we are a praying folk, well, at least a lot of us. I know not everybody who watches this is praying folk, but a lot of us are praying folk. So I think we should be praying about this, that the courts come to a godly decision, and of course that the Lord's will be done and that he be glorified regardless. And we here at the Watchdog, at least, will be keeping up with this case. I'm going to provide links in the description and all that. I didn't do a good job of setting up the description here today, but here's another look at the other case here. Supreme Court sets October date for Kentucky's abortion case. So there's actually going to be two, and actually both of them will be in October that they're going to be talked about. So there's going to be two cases the Supreme Court's going to be hearing, and hopefully we can actually see a big win here today, because you know, I firmly agree with the statement that rights are God-given and shall not be infringed. But there is no right to murder a child. There is, however, a right to life. And by the way, if those rights are God-given, then they only exist within the confines of God's justice. And murder is against that notion of justice. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and end the program here today. So I know it was a late one. I doubt there were very, very many people watching today. But those of you who were here, I appreciate you being here. If you liked this program, please do like and share. Please do subscribe if you have not done so. Please hit that notification bell to get notified every time that we go live. And get this shared to all the different social media platforms which you frequent. Of course, what good is a message without an audience to hear it? If you like this content and if you think that I am deserving of it, please consider giving to the Patreon and helping me to turn this into a career. I plan on doing full-time, not only apologetics, but also journalism, as I'm doing here, writing, and other such academic style work like philosophy and history and stuff like that. And of course, I have to earn that from you guys. So if you do feel led, please do consider giving to the Patreon. You can find me not only at Patreon, but also anywhere else, Minds, Gab, Parler, Twitter, Facebook, just by looking up the Synagogue. And please, please, please go to Rumble or BitChute and subscribe, to the Synagogue there. We only post Watchdog episodes there, and we have been having trouble recently. However, the days of conservative content are limited on YouTube, so we absolutely need to be preparing by using backup plans, by using alternative platforms. And by the way, you're never going to legitimize alternative platforms if you don't, quote, vote with your dollar, so to speak. And the way you're going to do that in this particular regard is by using alternative social media. So please get on Gab, get on BitChute, get on Rumble, get on Parler, follow your boy at the Synagogue. And with all of that being said, remember to be watchdogs and ask yourself this: in the face of Armageddon, will you compromise?